About an hour ago, I finished 500 books, listening, reading, in short, consuming them. I now want to discuss this shortly and the following points I want to mention. 525, decision to only read fact books, listening on Audible, slowly stopping audio podcasts, beginning to track my books, other media, future assumptions, and secondary time. 525, a couple of years ago, now about 3 years ago, was the idea that at age 25 I would have read 500 books. Now what I have to mention then later on maybe is what my previous numbers had been. I set this audacious goal and I would have had to hit I think 60 books in a couple of months, which I then didn't. But at the time I read about a book a week at least, and so not really reading, but listening. And so I figured this would be an audacious goal, which would drive me towards possibly change. Now, the next decision I want to discuss is the decision to only read fact books I made at around age 18. I still continued shortly before. It already had been kind of like this, and maybe also shortly after this, that I would read fiction in my secondary language, which is English. And so I would allow myself to read fiction in English for basically an educational purpose, but I eventually also stopped then reading fiction in English, as well I kind of grew out of these books, I think. Now this sounds pretentious. Now what I mean by this is the books I would read is Percy Jackson, for example. I would have read them already in my childhood, and so there was a new series. And so I just continued to read a little bit into the series, now in English. Now this decision turned out to turn listening to books for me from, not listening to books, from consuming books, if one uses consuming books as an umbrella term or an overarching term for listening as well as reading. So a couple of these 500 have been read books, I think about 200, 250, and the rest have been listened to books. Now the decision to only read fact books at around age 18 then meant for me that I would turn this book metric into a metric that actually kind of tracked my exposure to, somewhat at least facts, that's at least kind of some more similar to knowledge compared to before, where also fiction was in there. Similarly to how in terms of movies you could watch only documentaries, which would be more on the educational side, or you could also watch lectures and maybe track these in some way as a movie. But on the other side, so if a lecture has 2 hours, a movie has 2 hours, then you could also say a lecture is a movie, and so it would be an educational movie, whereas a movie that is just not that educational and entertainment based does not then have the result that the metric that results out of this increasing basically this metric, this counter, would then result in a possible, not possible, but in a positive change. And I searched for a metric that ideally, with increasing its counter, by basically increasing it, I would have a positive change that ideally would align with a future goal of me being a better version of myself, to say it very simply. Now, this decision therefore meant that, I now had a metric which, at least as of now, if I increase it with only fact books, it begins basically to somewhat act as a proxy for increasing my knowledge, at least with fact books. Not necessarily, of course I could also read actual academic books, but often I don't, so this is only a proxy to a certain extent for basically acquiring knowledge, but a better proxy than maybe counting the apples I eat, for example. Now, I then searched for a service basically, and also when I started listening to audiobooks, I have to mention maybe that audiobooks still weren't very available. So what I would do is I would go to the library locally, to the local library, and then basically insert the CDs and then convert them to MP3 to be able to listen to them. So it took quite some time to categorize all of these audiobooks and to get them basically into a digital format, which I then in the beginning used on my MP3 player, then on my Sony Ericsson, and then eventually on my HTC Desire X, until I eventually got kind of less. So I used basically these files less and less. Also the file management took quite a little bit of time as it became more and more available that you would have services that provided the audiobooks, and also these services allowed basically the file management to be handled in the back end. So I eventually listened more and more on Audible, and this is also the reason I currently am not that much listening on Audible any longer. Now, Audible seems to have the biggest library of books, which is a big upside. Now, the big downside of Audible is that with every single additional book, you may have to make a purchase decision. A purchase decision is usually connected to money. Now, even if you are subscribed to Audible, usually you get 1 credit a month, which means you can spend 1 book a month. But 1 book a month was also not sufficient for reaching my book goals, my book consumption goals, and so this was not really a long-term viable solution. But often I found that on other services that already have been available and were available, there were just these books I wanted to read, sometimes not available. So in terms of availability, I was kind of forced into Audible. So I have, 40, 45, 50 books on Audible, which I bought. Also, Audible has always these schemes running that if you then leave Audible and then you decide to go again, and you might have a link which then gives you 3 Audible books for a reduced price. And so I think I averaged a audiobook price of slightly below the usual, I think $8.95 or something like this you would pay for an audiobook if you buy it just normally, or $9.95 in terms of euros. But still an audiobook costs something, and it cannot be externalized in terms of the budgeting, such that I would pay a certain amount and this would then give me access to basically all audiobooks I would want to listen to. I hoped many times that Audible would turn into a service like this, but it didn't. I eventually tried out other services. Locally, there is one available that's called BookBeat, but that's mostly available for German audiobooks. Some are also English, but the selection is very limited. And so eventually I switched to Script, which also in terms of the selection less than Audible, but it meant to a certain extent that I could listen to more books, even though the selection, again, not that great compared to Audible. But still, I think, at least as of now, as I have searched for a couple of different options over the years again and again to find the best one, it seems that Script, and it now is called Everend, the audio service is now called Everend, or the media consumption piece is called Everend, which I am using now mostly, does have a somewhat reasonable selection. I still often cannot find books on there which I want to read, but nonetheless, I don't want to say it seems to increase. Maybe it is just my niche in which I'm currently operating in terms of listening to audiobooks. But, well, that's what I'm currently using. So what it means for me is that I can just listen to the next audiobook. So, for example, this morning I stopped the last audiobook because it was finished, and so I could just go through the list there, and it also recommended me audiobooks, and pick the next one and listen to it. Now, Script and Everend now also has this feature where, or rather not necessarily a feature, the limitation that you can only listen to a certain range of audiobooks until if you listen to a lot of audiobooks, then the range is somewhat limited, and then the audiobook you already saved and already might have downloaded, it does not work, which also seems to be not that, it seems to also prevent me from listening to the audiobooks I want to read or listen to. Now, also, the next point now is slowly stopping listening to audio podcasts. In the last years, which is in my case since the age of around maybe 12, 13, 14, I began listening to audiobooks, but also podcasts. And so podcasts were this new medium where you could listen to conversations, listen in on conversations mostly, or also people talking in a monologue, where you would be able to gain these, at least listen to these conversations. Now, over the years, my consumption evolved somewhat, not necessarily to the better or to the worse, but it just changed a little bit here and there. I would often listen quite a lot to podcasts. Also, since audiobooks just weren't available as an audible format. So books were still available as a book format, kind of, but often they were not available as audiobook. It has only, I think, been the recent years in which many books that appear also now appear in an audiobook version, and this seems to become more and more standard. Often the authors these days seem to read the audiobooks. But this partially caused me also to listen to lots of podcasts, where I also have to say maybe I learned a thing here and there, but it seems to be the case that due to the information is less dense in podcast, one could say. And also similar now in terms of books, you also have educational books, but you also have entertainment books and anything in between. In terms of podcasts also, but in terms of podcasts also there is this additional social element in which sometimes there is an interview and then the interviewee tries to basically be social and also not ruin his chances of having another guest on his podcast. And so there are many factors that seem to influence podcasts. I actually in the last 1 or 2 years have been drastically reducing my podcast consumption and replaced it more and more with audiobooks, as again I was subscribed to Script. Of course now this is also something that it is a cost, and in terms of the cost yearly I think it costs me now 115 euros or something like this. I previously had a student discount on Script or Everend, and well, Audible also maybe costs something similar. If you are subscribed for a year it probably costs 100 or I don't know, maybe 70, maybe 90 or 120, but I was never subscribed for a whole year, because then it would have meant that I would have gone the route of paying $9.95 for every single audiobook I buy, which doesn't seem that useful if I also have the other option. And so in terms of therefore optimizing my finances, I had to constantly the responsibility of subscribing to Audible at the right moment in time, and then desubscribing or unsubscribing, and then seeing, okay, if this option again appears that I can get these audiobooks for 3 months, for I don't know. And so this was also just a task that kept on occurring, and I needed to do right. And every time I didn't do it right, I basically lost money. So which turned this kind of experience of audiobook listening into not something that was that fun. And so there was this purchase decision with every single book. Now one could also argue maybe it is better to have this purchase decision with every single book, similar to every single piece of cake you buy, in order to maybe prevent you. But if the overall goal is to listen to more books, then this seems to be not very useful in terms of a strategic decision. Now, slowly stopping audio podcasts meant that in the last months and years, or years then months, I would only then listen to Huberman. I found myself listening to Huberman Lab mostly, but then also Huberman Lab began to have these interviews on there. And so eventually I realized I don't want to listen to all the Huberman Lab episodes any longer. A couple of months ago made the decision to listen to all Huberman Lab podcasts, also to be able to say this, and I did. And I already had listened to maybe 60, 70, 80% of them on audio, but also sometimes would watch them on YouTube. But I also stopped doing this. It seems to be the marginal unit of utility I get with listening to podcasts seems to be less compared to listening to audiobooks, as I am exposed to kind of new stimuli in also different areas compared to the Huberman Lab, where there is just Andrew Huberman. I mean, Andrew Huberman seems to be a very knowledgeable person, but he's also just one person and cannot make up for maybe the option to choose in between all the different books the world has ever written. So I began stopping to listening to podcasts also because I constrained my listening time more and more. Now usually these days, so in the past I would sometimes use also activity time, so time in which I do sport, physical activity time, for listening to podcasts and audio. But these days I don't so much. I also don't really find the spot any longer for audio listening so much. So currently I'm at least for 10 to 20 minutes usually listening to something that is audio while doing chores, which is basically cleaning my apartment and something else. I found that if I'm on the streets biking to somewhere, also in the gym, it doesn't seem to make sense. I have made up this rule, and this is now already the secondary time rule, that I would also, at around age 18, only listen to audiobooks. No, this was actually not at age 18. I would only listen to books from now on, and also to podcasts in secondary time additionally. So I basically would stop reading entirely. I would not spend any time reading any longer, unless it was for something which already had the next step, so it was part of an activity. I need to read this now in order to do this, but not just general reading for general purpose of information. I had to already have a kind of a purpose for now reading this blog article or this piece of media or something like this. Now, I made a couple of exemptions rather in the last couple of months, but mostly this rule has held up quite well. Now, the secondary timepiece, and in my own definition, means that if the audiobook listening reduces the utility, or let's just say the use of the primary time by more than 10%, I would then have to cut it out. Now, maybe I went up higher, maybe I went up to 95%. So basically, if the audiobook or the audio I listen to prevents me from doing the activity, very good, then I would stop listening to audio, which also has meant that I stopped listening to audio. So I never really listened to audio in the gym. So while doing resistance training, this always seemed to kind of prevent me, because there seems to be a constant thinking need in order to switch to exercises, but also to have proper exercise execution. With some types of cardio, it seems to work. Cycling outside, for example, seems to be quite reasonable. But then also I found in the last couple of months, when I do air bike sessions in the gym, which have been kind of the replacement for biking outside, but more optimized and standardized, that I am able to output less mental intensity, which then also results in less physical intensity, which over time results in less physical adaptation, it seems to be, if I listen to audio. Now, therefore, I also stopped doing this. So mostly, if I'm doing sports now, I don't listen to audio, unless sometimes I make an exception. And sometimes I also try it with running. I also, in the last couple of months, tried it 1 or 2 times, but mostly I find that it is just an additional thing. It is also a hurdle that keeps me from then running. If I want to go running, I change into my running clothes and I go running. But if I then additionally have to think about, okay, are my Bluetooth headphones charged? What if I then jump into the river afterwards? Where do I keep my phone, that it doesn't get stolen? And so all of these steps just increase the complexity, it seems, for making a decision that is then to run, and therefore reduce the likelihood that I will be able to run, and therefore just increase the cost of running. So I decided to simplify and not listen to audiobooks while doing sport for the most part. Now, when did I begin to track my books and other media is around also maybe the time at age 18, maybe to 22. So in the beginning, I would make a list in Evernote with all the books I have read. I would then also think about maybe I should also track my movies, mostly for kind of the contrary purpose. I would want to see how many movies I actually probably would have watched. So over the last couple of years, I tried to remember all the movies I watched, and I might have hit an accuracy of 80%, 90%. I just thought about all of these, and I sometimes searched for them and looked them up, and now I have kind of a list which allows me to do a rough time calculation of every movie watched, 1 or 2 hours of my life, and if I would have spent them otherwise, well, I would have maybe done something else, like learning an additional instrument or something like this. Now with movies, it mostly works for the reason that these are mostly entertainment, so therefore the utility can be replaced with something that in terms of opportunity cost has a higher well, not a higher cost, but a higher value. So the calculation seems to, or the rule switching basically to not watching a movie from switching a movie seems to be a kind of very useful decision that is also seemingly reasonable. I then began tracking my books. At this time, I had around 150 to 250 read books. I then over time also might have remembered a couple of more of them. I also went through my old bookshelves. I at this time still had. Right now I have sold most books I actually owned, which also might have negative side effects, but mostly I try to reduce the amount of stuff I have in order to live an easier life with less stuff and be able to move more. And I had to move a couple of times, or I did move a couple of times, which also is easier if you don't have shelves of books which you have to carry with you. The future. If I would have read at this point in time already 1,000 books, or listened to or consumed 1,000 books, then if I had managed to do this with all other things being equal, then I think this version of me would be a better version of me. And that's kind of the whole idea. Finding a metric where if I increase all other things being equal, or ceteris paribus as in economics the term describes this, I would then be a better version of myself. And so this was the idea, to also try to just increase this. Now, of course, every now and then you read a book and it turns out to be not very useful. Or you begin a book and then you begin to doubt whether this was a good decision. But overall, I would say the average utility of a book is positive in my case. If I don't replace reading a book with something else, or if reading a book or listening or consuming a book doesn't replace another more useful activity, or activity with a higher utility, one could say. And so, as long as this is true, and this is to a certain extent true, because I listen only in secondary time, even though sometimes when doing the chores I find myself trying to extend the time I do chores in order to listen to more of the audiobook, which seems to be interesting at this point in time. Nonetheless, the next goal is somewhat obviously 1,000 books, and if I just assume, of course I had my childhood in which I was maybe not fully developed yet, one could say, so within my childhood I would have had many years in which I would not have been able to listen to books, to the same books I listen to now, but excluding this, if it took me now around 28 years to listen to 500 books or to have consumed 500 books, then, well, do I reach 1,000 books only at age 50? Seems like 1,000 books seems, of course, much, but also not that much if I consider that I already, I think, have watched around 1,000 movies or something like this. I'm not exactly sure, maybe it's 1,100, I would have to look up that list again. And now assumptions. What are the assumptions I already made? I already tried to define a couple of those. First of all, an increase in book count is, in my case, because I only I only consume fact books. And what is a fact book? I try to also include not necessarily only fact books, but also culturally relevant books, which could mean that if Johann Wolfgang von Goethe wrote a piece which is particularly relevant in the culture I live in, which is in this case Germany, then it would make sense to have read that book. Oh, I have read this book. It would be something that is also socially accepted and also maybe might return a social reward in terms of, or if you take another example, I read this book, which is a novel about, I don't know, then this might not be something that has this reward. So if it is culturally relevant, then I can also include it. Other than this, it is fact books, which stem out of different fields, but yeah, well, then the secondary time assumption is also to a certain extent true. I recently broke the rule by going on to a walk for around 2 hours, which I basically usually never do. And because if I go on a walk, I can as well go on a run, which is then activity. But if I go on a run, then it should be a scheduled run, because then this optimizes intensity and also workload. So physical load in terms of Garmin measuring the load of an exercise. So I listened to an audiobook there, for example, and this was one of the big exceptions of this rule. And I also, in the last couple of months, sometimes opened up books at the library, and I allowed myself basically to have no purpose of reading this other than, okay, this seems interesting. Now, well, these were basically all the different things I wanted to discuss. So, closing. I actually reached this now a couple of days or weeks earlier than I thought, because I did not put in all the labels in my Notion tracking list, which meant that I actually thought I had 498 as of today, but I already had 500. So this was a surprise, and this often seems to be then how things turn out. You kind of forget about them, not necessarily forget about them, but they just, if you not necessarily in this case put in the work, because listening to an audiobook might not be considered work, but if you continue to have the habits which lead then to a result, in my case listening to audiobooks, which then increases my book count, then eventually, well, the book count increases also to a number. I actually hoped very much that I got to this number at this point in time and not just a little bit later. Also, if I think about myself, so either I think about the same version of me, so ceteris paribus, at one point in time. So if at this point in time I already would have read 1,000 books, then I probably would be a better, more knowledgeable person compared to the version of me that is standing here right now. And the other assumption would be that if I now have a fixed amount of books, I fix the book count basically, and I bring this into the present, then this would also be something. So the more I bring it into the present, if let's say this is 1,000 books and I bring this into the present, basically the closer I can get it to the present, the better probably also the version of me that is then having this earlier access to basically the knowledge which I would have acquired at 1,000 books. To some extent, maybe a book count in my case also acts as a pseudo proxy for knowledge only, because I failed at 2 study programs, and so I might have read more books because of this. But it seems to be the case that, well, reading books is something that is positively contributing to my life, so I probably will continue to listen to them currently on Scribd. Maybe Audible in the future switches also to a subscription, which would be nice. And of course, it would maybe not make sense to then be subscribed to both services. But just one service where I could listen to all the books of the world would be great.